Emily, this week, the Monetary Authority of Singapore put out a statement to address, quote, misconceptions after the collapse of FTX. What's going on here? What's this really about?
Right. So the latest news from Singapore is that they've been under fire basically for putting Binance on an investor alert list and not FTX. And so, apparently there were some crypto traders in Singapore who had the impression from that Binance was more dangerous than FTX and thus put their money into FTX. And as we all know, that probably wasn't the best idea. So Singapore Monetary Authority of Singapore MAS has responded to this, basically clarifying that. I think we have a statement from them, an excerpt from the statement, but basically saying that the reason here we go. Basically, while Binance and FTX are both not licensed here, the difference is they claim that Binance was actively soliciting users in Singapore while FTX was not. So that's their justification. But this is part of a much larger story where Singapore is clearly very spooked by a lot of failed projects that have been linked to Singapore. For example, Terraform Labs, Three Arrows. I'm sure you guys saw there's kind of this iconic photo of this empty Three Arrows office in Singapore with like mail under the door, ZipMex. So, Singapore has been widely known as like this really crypto-friendly jurisdiction and like the crypto hub of Asia. But, I think they've been spooked by a lot of these projects that are tied to Singapore.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned this string of bad breaks, and I definitely want to talk about that as it relates to where sort of the power center in Asia lies as a crypto market. We've seen a lot of momentum around Singapore. Historically, Hong Kong has certainly been in the conversation. What does this mean, again, for sort of this jurisdictional dynamic in the Far East?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it really is, jurisdiction hopping or whack-a-mole or whatever you call it. I mean, if you look at basically this sort of larger story of Asia, for a while, 2016, 2017 era, China was the center of everything. As we all know, China really cracked down on crypto. Then a lot of the movement went to Japan and Korea, but then Japan got hacked. A crypto exchange in Japan got hacked in early 2018. And I'd say since around that time, Singapore has really been like the star of the show. It's like Singapore is the crypto hub of Asia. But now, I think some of that is in question. Now, it's important to note here that a lot of these restrictions are aimed at the retail market specifically. That's different from, say, digital asset firms setting up shop in Singapore or institutions. It's retail oriented. But at the same time, you have Hong Kong, who is now signaling that they are going to be more open to the retail market after kind of like a relatively cold period, because Hong Kong was hit very hard by COVID and by a lot of other things. And I think they're trying to attract more crypto talent to the region. And Japan has also shown signs recently of opening up. So it's interesting. It's constantly shifting landscape.
So, Emily, both Hong Kong and Singapore, of course, are basically city-states. I mean, Hong Kong, of course, belongs to China, but two systems, one government, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so how much of these regulations that you were talking about that were kind of aimed at the retail investor, how much does it actually reflect the retail appetite in these jurisdictions? And are there attitudes that, well, we're going to deal with the retail situation for our own citizens and, so be it for everyone else, so we don't care? Or is it that they kind of want to crack down and say, well, we want crypto here, but not too much? Where does this all fall?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. So Singapore is not a hugely significant retail market. So just the fact that they're signaling that they want to have stronger consumer protections and more restrictions on retail is not necessarily going to shut down Singapore's crypto scene. However, the symbolism of it is very important, right? These governments send a symbol to the world. So, and you look at, for example, we have Vitalik Buterin of Ethereum. He's already criticized Singapore for their approach towards regulation because he's basically saying, okay, Singapore, you're doing this blockchain without crypto thing, and that doesn't really make sense. And we had Brian Armstrong of Coinbase also criticizing Singapore's regulatory approach. So I think it definitely sends a signal, and I think it could discourage potentially some digital asset companies from setting up shop there.
I wanted to ask about FTX. FTX famously got its start in Hong Kong, right? The site of many a Sam sleeping in a beanbag picture that was in the Hong Kong office before they relocated to the Bahamas. Do you think that Hong Kong dodged a bullet here as it relates to these regulatory conversations with FTX, or is it still sort of in the crosshairs as it relates to potentially supporting some bad actors in the space?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Zach. I've been actually thinking about that a lot because you're right. I mean, FTX was very associated with Hong Kong. FTX was very associated with Asia. FTX is kind of like an Asian powerhouse. I think that's something that's often left out of this conversation. But then Sam did leave Hong Kong. The reasons for which are sort of unclear. I think it was part regulatory and part COVID restrictions. But and then, he actually addressed this. I think when Hong Kong sort of signaled that they were going to open up more towards crypto, Sam was like, "Oh, too late," which, because we already left, which I'm sure that's not how Hong Kong sees it. But, I think the question here, again, it's one of symbolism, right? I think if FTX was still based in Hong Kong, was still known to be sort of like a Hong Kong exchange, and this all happened, it would be a very bad look for Hong Kong. And I think there would probably be regulatory action that followed it.